so pleased you all could join us here for the fourth Visiting Artist Lecture in the Painting and Printmaking Department at Yale. Our visiting artist today is Claire Ashley. Claire is a Scottish-born, Chicago-based artist that mines the language of painterly abstraction, monumental sculpture, slapstick humor, and pop art to transform ordinary materials into inflatable painted sculptures. She received her BFA from Gray's School of Art in Scotland and her MFA from the School of Art Institute of Chicago, where she currently teaches in the Department of Contemporary Practices and the Department of Painting and Drawing. Her work has been shown internationally at such venues as Art Basel in Germany, the Tetley Center for Contemporary Art in England, the Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas, and most recently alongside some incredible artists in the exhibition Portable Sculpture at the Henry Moore Institute in the UK. We're so happy here to have you with us, Claire, and welcome. I pass it over to you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Curtis. Here, first up, my new addition, Theo.
Oh.
So I'm sorry if you have barking in the background, that's why. He's a troublemaker. Thank you so much for coming today, you guys. I will share my screen and we will get going. Just 1 second. All right, so I thought today I would start just with a bit of background to sort of help you see why I'm making at least I think why I'm making the things I'm making today, and sort of how those early influences have really stuck with me. So bear with me for the first maybe 10 slides as we get through sort of historic artistic influences and sort of positioning of my work as a person in the world. So I grew up in Edinburgh in the 1980s, 70s and 80s, I should say, aging myself. But it is surprising how those early influences and the listening to Depeche Mode and Soft Cell and Bananarama and the colors and customs of Scotland and Edinburgh in particular, with the painted buildings and the interior bright color painted houses, really have continued to influence my my thinking and my practice. And obviously the scale of the landscape of Scotland, even though it's a very small country, it has such a variety of landscape and a drama of landscape. And I spent a lot of my youth doing sailing on the West Coast in the summer. And so the sort of gargantuan sort of scale shifts of the landscape have really infected, I think, the way that I think about the landscape. But it's not so much in a romantic way. It's more like in Trainspotting in the right, sort of this sort of raw, unkempt, maybe ecstatic or ridiculous version of things, rather than a romantic view. But here are some spinnakers and sails, and not boats that I was on, but the early influence of sailing as a kid. I just realized recently, like 2 years ago, that that's of course part of the reason why I love inflatables, because it's this billowing, large scale material filled with air that really is a big part of my experience of nature, right, or of the world. And then the last piece I wanted to talk specifically about Scotland is that I think at its the most essential piece of being Scottish that has stayed with me over a lifetime has been this idea of a sense of humor, and this sort of deeply self-deprecating sense of humor that Scots have, and the physical comedy of Billy Connolly in particular, which I'm going to show you a little video clip of him talking about incontinence pants. So this sort of the idea of a different form of billowing materials. So here we go. Hope you can.
Cares not a jot. 7 gallons down each leg. I'll take you home in a minute. Just go and empty my underwear.
So the idea of absurdity and silliness, but also super irreverent, explicit content has been a big part of sort of the way that I like to sort of think about tongue-in-cheekness in terms of my own work, even though I take it extremely seriously. Also, when I was growing up, I was a big sci-fi geek and Star Trek fan. So even in Scotland, we were watching a lot of, or I was at least watching a lot of Star Trek. And then in 1993, I moved to Chicago, and so this whole world of kitsch, crass, plastic, and neon gaudiness sort of opened up in a different way than the color palette of Edinburgh. And I really like this sort of a different sense of social code that was a big learning curve for me, and also a different kind of permission that was given as to what art could be potentially. So that move took a long time to kind of gestate in my thinking as an artist, but it has sort of built a really particular way that I think about work, I think. Then the next sort of major piece of the puzzle for me as an artist is that from 2000 to 2004, I had 3 children. The oldest one is now 21. So I have been a parent for 21 years now, which is crazy. But these as sort of living, breathing, energetic beings in their own right, and the fact that I was freaking out about the responsibility of being a parent was part of the process that led me to inflatables, because I was looking at bounce houses. I was looking at them with their cuddly toys. I was thinking of them as sort of ebullient beings in and of their own right. And I was also thinking about airbags as safety devices in cars and I was thinking about inflatables as both containers and sort of ways that you could limit the body maybe somehow. So that's part of the puzzle of me as an artist, and the thing that the kind of shaping that happened early on in my sort of life as an artist. I should say that even in Gray's at 18, I went to Gray's School of Art in Aberdeen, so a shout out to Gray's and to Robbie Bush, who's here, one of my early teachers. I knew even then that I could never make something that had a flat surface or a straight edge as a paint, but I loved the process of painting. I loved the color of painting. I loved the action of painting, but I was more interested in a sculptural physicality in relationship to that. So in terms of artistic influences, I was really inspired by Nikita Sanfal, both in terms of the scale and color palette of what she was doing, but also this sort of hyper aggressive feminist stance that she was taking in terms of positioning her work in a really explicit and foregrounded way. So she was a very early great influence. And Sam Gilliam is somebody I was really looking at too, in terms of this idea of being able to go through a fairly quick, rough, very physically energetic process in terms of making, staining and dyeing and attacking the surface of painting, that then ended up as a quite theatrical kind of drape and reference things outside painting in the way that it was installed, and referenced or thought about site specificity in relationship to architecture. Elizabeth Murray is somebody who I was looking at, an SAIC alum, and I was looking at her work as somebody who was pulling domestic content into these very large-scaled, abstract, shaped canvases, and that was something I was hungry to sort of try and figure out how I pulled that into my work too. Linda Benglis. And of course, I loved her physical, sculptural poured objects and these resin objects that then she mixed in glow-in-the-dark substances, materials to them. So they had, what I was excited mostly about her work was this idea of 2 states of being, right? So they had 2 alter egos to them, one that was a daytime state and one that was a nighttime state. So one that was a party animal and one that was maybe a more normal person. I think that that kind of duality is something that I've been really interested in playing with my work too. And then lastly, before we get to the actual work, I just wanted to show some of these sort of research source material things that I think about in my work. So I move sort of from sci-fi geekdom in terms of Star Trek sets and fake boulders to asteroid Ida, to giant jellyfish off the coast of Japan, to the Aurora Borealis, to ET, like, and then these weird little creatures called tardigrades that have, some people, scientists believe they came from outer space many millennia ago because they can survive anything. And then of course the surface of Mars, where we're all sort of really thinking about life on other planets, the potential, the futurism of having to leave this planet. So that's something I've been thinking a lot about in this sort of weird sci-fi futurist most recent work I've been making. And then lastly but not least, certainly, is SpongeBob. So he is a big influence in my, at least was in my early practice, because I was watching cartoons with my kids when they were tiny, and thinking about how do I think about anthropomorphic or figurative forms that aren't totally figurative, or how do I think about amoebic softening of edges and corners and stylizing of figuration in the work. The last one is places where color is a sort of hyper communicator. And I think of color as being sort of genetically linked or coded to our instinct survival in the animal kingdom. And so we know we have to pause and pay attention to it somehow, and that we're thinking of it, assessing it for either pleasure and procreation or danger somehow. So it's sort of this attraction and repulsion system that I use pretty aggressively in the way I make work. So I'm looking at graffiti, I'm looking at tattooed skins, I'm looking at camouflage in animals as sort of forms of ways that color is communicating really aggressively in the world. Okay, and then just before we start, I just wanted to show you some studio clips to show you that I work in a really tight studio space in my backyard. In order to see the forms fully inflated, I'm often inflating them out in the garden as opposed to in the studio, because they don't always fit. So this sort of idea of not ever truly seeing the full form of the work. This is a relatively small piece in the studio right now, so it does actually fit in the studio, but a lot of the bigger pieces that I make will not fit. And so I'm stitching them together, I'm sewing them with my commercial grade sewing machine. It's not a super fancy machine, just with a straight stitch in the studio. And then I'm often painting them flat on the floor so that they pick up the surfaces and folds of the skin, and then inflating them in my backyard to sort of see what the shape looks like at the end. So there's sort of a different collection of processes there. Okay, so my particular relationship to painting, here's the first piece I'm going to show you from 2011. It's called Star Patrick, which is a nod to Patrick from SpongeBob, obviously. I was sort of, this is the first piece that I had been making these inflatable forms for a while, but I hadn't yet got up the gumption basically to paint on them. And so this was after a conversation on Facebook, actually, with an artist colleague of mine, I decided I was going to attack it with spray paint. So all the work I make is not airbrushed. It's actually using evil spray paint, Montana and Rust-Oleum and evil stuff. So I've got to mask up every time. I can't really use acrylic through an airbrush because it retains a stickiness. So when the inflatables fold up, the paint would stick to itself. So that's why I have to go with the Montana or Rust-Oleum spray paint. But I do like that I am utilizing, it's really important for me in the work to utilize low brow materials and democratically available materials as opposed to high art, fine art materials in the work. I really like that I'm interested in the work as being as democratic as possible, as accessible as possible to as wide an audience as possible. And so I want people to be engaged and excited about touching the forms, right? About playing, about feeling like they can laugh at the work, about connecting with the materials in the work in an immediate way, rather than feeling like they have to have knowledge of the contemporary art world to access it. But I'm hoping that there are also levels in terms of thinking about abstract painting that I'm super wedded and dedicated to and passionate about, thinking about monumental sculpture, soft sculpture and the history of that, thinking about utopian architecture and the history of that as part of the level with which you can attach yourselves to the work if you have more of an art training. The other thing I should say is I have sort of 3 wings of my practice that I'm going to show you today. And so one of those wings of practice is that's kind of idea of the singular object. The second is the site-specific intervention. And then the third is the performative prop. So those are the 3 things I'm going to try and talk about. But to go back for a second and to connect to this idea, I think of painting or my work as being interested in pushing against paintings in men's history, right? But that in some, like I think of it like a mangled Darwinian kind of a creature that is evolving forcefully in the universe and being super obnoxious in the way that it exists monumentally in the world. So Faris Jabr wrote this amazing article from 2019 in the New York Times called How Beauty is Making Scientists Rethink Evolution. And so I just wanted to read a wee quote from it. So ornaments, Darwin proposed, evolved through a separate selection process he called sexual selection. Females choose the most appealing males according to their standard of beauty, and as a result, males evolve toward that standard despite the costs. That innate sense of beauty itself can become an engine of evolution, pushing animals towards aesthetic extremes. And so I'm really interested in this instance, and in the animal kingdom at least, that women are in full control, evolutionary control, right? And men are the ones contorting their bodies towards standards of beauty, which obviously in the real world isn't always the case. So on that note, to kind of launch and to show you these sort of 3 wings of my practice. So these as evolutionary beings, right? So the idea of ornament, the idea of appendage, the idea of embellishment, but that the way that I'm painting these forms is that I'm thinking about like a crazy tattooed skin on the surface of these sort of living, breathing beings. And I really like inflatables because of their reference points that I mentioned earlier, but also that they innately are inhaling and exhaling. They are part of the grid almost in terms of their connection to electricity. So they're connected to a kind of a system that we built as humans, but they're also living and dying every day in terms of when you're plugging them and unplugging them. So I like that sort of metaphorical connection to human existence that is built into these pieces. So this is clown on the left and knees up on the right. And one that feels more like maybe a reference to Jasper John's targets, and the one on the right that feels maybe more like a graffiti reference or some kind of X marks the spot, perhaps. So the second wing of the practice is this idea of site-specific architectural intervention. And this piece I built for terrain exhibitions in Oak Park. And if you're not, don't know Oak Park, it's the little town, first suburb west of Chicago, where there are a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright houses. He lived and worked here. And so it's a very kind of arts and craftsy, liberal, super liberal town. But it's all about taste. And so I was really interested in doing some like very distasteful, obnoxious, like blob emanating out of one of these arts and crafts bungalows in the town. It was right opposite an elementary school, so the kids would walk past every day and be able to point at it and say, what the hell is that? And not everybody had an answer, right? So I like that there's a sort of a set of questions that these things provoke in people who aren't familiar with contemporary art. So this piece is called Limes and Bricks Up Pink, You Tasteless Hunk. And I was sort of interested in how I can embed humor at multiple levels in the things that I make. So not only in the physical forms that I'm building and the paint surface and color palette that I might be using, but also in the titling of the work. And I am not a writer in any way, shape, or form. So I think of titling as sort of like a James Joycean kind of a game, where I can use language to reference maybe the color palette or the form or the explicit content that I'm trying to get at in the work, but basically smash things together. So I'm making new phrases or words from this kind of additional process in the language. This piece is on the left is Limp Punk Love Junk. And it sort of, I like this piece because it feels like it had nowhere to go. It was really squished and pressed into the space in a way that people commented on, that they thought they felt sorry for it and had empathy for the object because it felt stuck. And then the piece on the right is called B15, and that was a collaboration with another artist, Bahar Yarukoglu, who makes these super beautiful, colorful video projected pieces with shards of plexiglass. And so for this piece, I built this piece with pockets in it. And I did not paint this work so that Bahar was able to project on 3 sides of the object. And she was also able to insert the plexiglass into the form itself, sort of like it was puncturing the work a little bit. So that in terms of how collaboration and site specificity become really important in the way that I think that my singular studio practice evolves in different ways because of collaborations I'm working on that become really important. So this one was a show that I did in Philadelphia. I drove all of this work in my family minivan across the country and basically unpacked and plugged everything in, and it inflated over a couple of hours. So I installed it in half a day. And the curators were really concerned that I wouldn't have enough work to fill this space because it's a 100-foot space, it's 50 feet wide, and it was 30 feet tall. And they said they had never had an artist be able to really deal with the kind of cavernous of the space before I plugged everything in. So the piece in the back, in the way back, is called My Little Pony. And so I was really interested in how the sort of conflation of childhood object and monumental scaled sculpture could have a conversation, right? And sort of like a reference to the Trojan horse a little bit too. Like it seems it has a looming presence to it, but it seems like playful as well. So you're not sure which one to believe, maybe. And again, the language in this one, the peep-dyed crevice, hot pink ridge, was a place for me to code a different kind of a content into the way that people were understanding what these forms were referencing, maybe. Oh, I should also say, I forgot to say this, but the paint job on the surfaces are, I think I did tell you that I often will lay the fabric down on the studio floor, so it sort of picks up the folds of the fabric, which you can see in the My Little Pony piece on in the back. But then I'm also often painting the work when it's inflated. So the piece in the foreground is I'm sort of drawing with the spray cans on the surface. I'm using stenciled sections to create pattern. I'm inflating and deflating the objects and painting them so it picks up the folds in different instances. So it's a very sort of physical, active relationship, but fast, relatively fast process of painting. So then the third wing of the practice is this idea of the performative prop or the body extension. And so that's where the Billy Connolly slapstick humor, Benny Hill, another British comedian who's thinking a lot about slapstick humor, comes back in full force into the work in a way that, what am I going to say? Like is self-deprecating, but also really trying to extend the work beyond the white walls of a gallery space, and really be critical of the static qualities of sculpture and the this flat qualities of painting by pulling it out of itself and into another realm. These pieces were painted when they were inflated, so that sort of soft, smooth gradient is built in the aeration process of the spray paint. So both the objects are filled with air, but also the way that they are painted does rely heavily on air mixing the color, as it were. So it's a very soft mixing process. And so here's a little video of this piece, Double Disco, where I was trying to reference my guilty pleasure of dancing, middle-aged guilty pleasure of dancing, but also slow that down and think about, for this piece, the Joseph and Victoria had to learn a choreographed dance outside of the forms, and then when they entered the forms, they were not able to see each other. So they had to find one another by calling for one another and to connect again. So here we go. So for the audio, obviously I chose a section that it's recognizably a Bee Gees song, obviously, but the video starts with a very slow and low version of the song and ends up with a very high and fast version of the song in terms of how I stretched it in an audio editing program. And so I was really interested in that slapstick being built into the way that the dancers had to respond to the audio component as well, in terms of speed and chaos and unkemptness, right? So that it wasn't necessarily important for me always to work with professional dancers. It was more important that there was a kind of clunkiness to the way that the objects moved and an imperfection in some sense. But I realized that the Double Disco pieces were kind of lonesome because the dancers couldn't see one another. Although I should have mentioned in the last slide that this idea of two-ness is kind of really important in terms of my connection to being human. Like I liked that the work that has a pair of elements that are connected to one another are utilizing or drawing upon the recognition of a human desire or need to connect with some other person in the world. So this sort of a priori basic human instinct, sort of similar to the way that I think about color. It becomes an important marker of both formal marker and content marker in the work. But this piece, Ruddy Udder Dance, was built for 12 people. And I was sort of thinking about both a caterpillar and a giant lumbering cow or alien being lumbering across the American landscape. And it's sort of like lawless, inappropriate, over the top sort of behavior in the field, like it was going mad somehow. And what I liked about this work is that the performers were able to have more camaraderie inside of the form. They could see each other inside of it, although the viewers could only see their legs outside. It was important to me that I was trying to find like American country song that was not about love or God or cars, which is not easy to do. But I found one that was about having a good time. And so the idea of that very kitsch country song, sort of like provoking this crazy beast into effulgent, like ecstatic dance, was kind of funny and exciting for me to try out. So here's a little video clip.
Work all week long, punching that clock dust to dawn, counting the days to Friday night. That's when all the conditions are right for a good time. I need a good time. Yeah, I've been working all week and I'm tired. I don't want to sleep. I want to have fun. It's time for a good time.
So what I loved about that piece was you could hear the performers whooping and lying and laughing and yelling at one another. So that internal dialogue translated to the kind of personality of the beast itself somehow, which I really I liked what happened there. Yeah, so this is also a view of the inside of a different of the My Little Pony piece when we were rehearsing on Daley Plaza in freezing fucking cold Chicago winter. But this gives you a sense of what the performers are experiencing on the inside, and what a viewer gets to see if they're willing to do this crazy dance, what they get to see on the inside. So it feels very like a stained glass cathedral like view. So at this point, what I want to do is transition. I sort of showed you these three wings of my practice. And so now I thought I would show you some details of things inside of each of those wings of the practice, so that you get more of a sense of how that set of queries or questions or those curiosities unravel themselves, both through collaborative work, through how that comes back into the studio in the singular practice, thinking about different alter egos of the work, etc. So seeing this view of the work made me realize that I wanted to be able to share that, share the idea of being inside the belly of the beast with a larger audience, not just those people who are willing to dance. And so I did this project for Facebook Chicago, one of their artist in residency projects in their new Chicago offices, where I was thinking about, I quilted the walls of this conference room, I painted the floor, I painted a rug. I sort of wanted to make this sort of people be able to experience this sort of internal belly in some sense. I'm sure with the yellow intensity and the color, it made all the meetings in the conference room, people go mad, but I was kind of interested in that sort of a very aggressive color palette in this piece. And then I also, this piece is called Close Encounters, Adam's Madam. And it's the largest piece I've made to singular piece, I guess, made to date. But what happened in this piece is that I painted both the outside of it and the inside of it. And I added plastic windows to the surface, which were discovered when I was doing a collaborative project with my colleague who's here today, Mark Jeffrey. I was building a large object that performers could be inside, and so I created these oculus sections in the surface of the skin, which I'd never done before. But that really allowed the viewer to be able to see inside of the form, inside the belly of the beast. And to participate or to sort of have a sort of cathedral-like experience when viewing the piece from both underneath. You could get under this work and look up into it, and you could also up to the 3 floors of the museum. You could look at it through the windows on different levels. But I like that this creature was both maybe welcoming and looming in terms of the Steven Spielberg reference in the title, and the sort of idea, the reference to the madam as being, I like that it was my feminist sort of tweak or tendencies to sort of think about this very large monumental being as being in full control of the room again. So, and I should also mention that I do think of all the things that I make as weird self-portraiture and blobby over the top beings, just like myself. So this is a view from up underneath the work up into the center of the work. There was a skylight above this piece, so it was a really beautiful light-filled kind of luminosity that glowed. And some detailed shots of the work from the 3rd floor, looking down on it, and then down underneath where I made a rug for that piece, so that, and a beanbag, so people could come in and lay down and spend time and gaze up into the being itself. I sort of thought of it like I wanted people to have a similar wow experience to looking at like the natural phenomena of clouds in the sky or something like that. So that was sort of part of my demand for that work. It was the first piece that I hung from the ceiling too, so that like I had to use much thinner material for this work. So this is PVC coated ripstop nylon, like raincoat and tent material, as opposed to the more heavy material that you've seen so far in the work that's PVC coated canvas tarpaulin, like the stuff painters use to cover the floors when they're painting houses. So it has a rubbery coating to one side, which holds the paint really nicely, but is very heavy. Whereas this stuff is much more durable and lightweight, but it doesn't hold the paint in the same way. So each material decision that changes sort of sets up a whole new set of questions and problems in the solutions for painting. When I was there installing the work, a lot of people were asking me about the Sharpie marker drawings all over the surface of the form. And what happened in that instance was when I was making the form, it was a mind melt to build it, just to know all the parts that needed to go together. And it was such a massive form that again, I was making panels of it in the studio and then having to number them so I could remember which went where. And so that, then the decision, or it forced my hand, obviously, to have to make a decision about how I incorporate that numbering system into the finished form, because the Sharpie marker wasn't able to be easily removed. And so then I started drawing on it to think about UFO mapping, or some kind of a kind of cataloging or mapping of something that wasn't necessarily exactly clear what that was. So actually the numbering system is the ages of my kids at the time, and my husband and I, and so there's another layer of quite hidden and coded self-portraiture in the way that the mark making existed. So that piece then went to Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art into their color field show, and was installed in this atrium sort of courtyard space outdoors. But funnily enough, the work, even though it's inflatable, I don't work with super heavyweight outdoor quality inflatable material. So it did not survive very well in this space because of both the heat, the sun, and the tornadoes that were coming through that summer. So it didn't, unfortunately, the piece didn't last very long. I was able to repair it enough for it to be shown again, but it's not been the same since. However, rather than that being a reason to stop making inflatables, I'm sort of excited by their temporality, right? I'm excited by the ephemeral qualities of inflatables, and the fact that I have to constantly take care of them. Like the mothering thing that I was doing with my kids when they were younger is sort of built into the way that I am taking care of these objects in my artistic practice too. So I'm patching them as they break, I'm repainting them, repairing them all the time. So it's sort of a laborious process, but I like that there is a temporality to them rather than them being permanent beings, like they have a lifespan, literally. And then the piece on the right, I just wanted to show you from that same show, because that was the first time I'd sort of thought more about, well, not the first time, but one of the first exhibition solutions that I thought about putting the work, the inflatable, under more tension and preventing it, like containing it differently, adding an S&M quality to it, which I really liked that it was building in a figurative reference to the work at multiple levels, if that makes sense. I also should say that this piece, and I'll show you some more work that has the similar color palette, but was done with the work inflated, with a lot of aeration happening in terms of the way that the color gets added to the space, a lot of layering color, and then a layer of neutrals to the color palette. So it sort of softens it and pushes it back to more maybe bruised skin or bolder type of palette. And then this is actually the same piece installed two different ways. And again, utilizing that sense of being strung up, right? Or being contained in a kind of netting in this instance. So this is Honey Bunny in a Pickle from two versions of the Colorfield show, or sorry, it was in the Colorfield show in Florida on the left, those two images on the left. And then it was in a show called How We See Materiality and Color on the right. And I worked for a long time. I actually tortured my children by making them help me braid these ropes, these 100-foot long ropes, after I'd just broken my foot. So it was sort of like a complicated torturing process for everybody in the family while I made this object and had my son paint the ropes. But I really like that the mapping idea from the Close Encounters piece is also embedded in the way that I think about utilizing graffiti or tattooed kind of pirate map coding in the X marks the spot in this work too. So more about this color palette or these forms. This show curated by Rachel Adams Miller at the UB Anderson Gallery in Buffalo was again trying to think more about, it's called Loathsome Beauty, Loaded Body. And I was really trying to think about in my sort of feminist realm about the limitations on the female body. At the time, Trump was setting up plans to limit abortion again. And I was just like, oh my God, here we go again. And so I was interested in these forms referencing appendages or body parts and referencing the color of something that felt amoebic or like an internal organ, but also something maybe like a boulder or a rock form, so that that sort of idea of body and landscape gets conflated into the work as much as I possibly can. So again, lots of aeration in the painting process. And then I was also going back in with my finger and marking in small X's to some places in the surface. Just another view of this work. I should say that some of these objects are also able to be, they have zippers built into them, stitched into them, so that the performer in these pieces, I call some of these pieces hot rocks, and that the performer can actually get entirely inside these and roll around in them, so that there's a slower understanding of how the objects are becoming kinetic. And I didn't include an image or video of this work at the College of DuPage Gallery, where there was a performance where the hot rocks were rolling around the space as well. Sorry, that was my bad, but you could look at my website and find it there. And then I also wanted to show you the work when it's on timers, because I've done a couple of shows where I've really thought about embedding the kind of the potential life and death forms of these creatures in the way that one might come upon the work in the gallery, or be surprised by the work if you're in the gallery when it's inflated and then it suddenly starts deflating, right? So here's a little time-lapse video of the pieces inflating and deflating. So I really like that it gets at my super existential but playful kind of relationship to body and life, and freaking out about having kids, right? So you're always trying to keep them alive in some sense. All right, I think that's probably enough, but you can see, so there's 5 groups of objects on 5 different timers, so that I set them to inflate and deflate at different times. All right, so then I realized when I collaborated with Atamar and Mark Jeffrey, he had performers inside of the work, but they were visible. And I realized then that I had ignored a really important kind of real estate in the work in terms of its internal space. I also got to this really textured sand, it's built up with acrylic paint and sand and leaves and feathers. And then there's a layer of spray paint on top of that so that it doesn't stick to itself when I fold it. And I only got to that because collaborating with Mark and his performance group, they asked me to make a piece that felt like it was tarred and feathered. And I really like, again, that collaboration will push your edges, right? Will extend your work in much more quickly in ways that you might not give yourself permission to do if you're just in the studio by yourself. And so then this piece, I then decided, okay, I could actually insert a second inflatable inside the first as a kind of a heart or a pair of lungs. And then I also, for this work, lit the interior of the inside inflatable because it was built with Tyvek, which allows light through it, and at a very much more lightweight skin to the work. I also rubbed expandable foam across the surface of the work in this one and then spray painted, so it's much more textured, gunky surface on the inside piece, and then on the outside piece is a much more rubbery leather, almost like Village People. I love the idea of it being blinged up, and so I added these chains and 3D printed objects to the surface to make it feel like it was embellished or wearing some jewelry somehow. So that's the story of how I ended up. Like it takes a long time to kind of process or realize how to take advantage of different aspects or wings of your thinking or discoveries that you're making over here, and how long it takes you to pull them to the center and utilize them in the main body of your work. So, but that sense of play becomes really important in the studio to think through. So these are more of the expandable foam surfaces. Obviously, super not archival. Every time you deflate them and fold them, shit falls off. But I, again, love the aging process. I love the imperfection of that. I love the irreverence of that. Also, the piece on the right was the first time that I made a garment, thinking more about it as a fashion garment, maybe. So when it's deflated, it acts more like a cloak or a cape, and you can see the performer's body, head, hands, and feet coming out of the object, which I had never allowed the full body maybe to be visible before. So those are sort of tests that I'm thinking about as well. So surface, amounts, relative ratios of body to form. The one on the left hung on the wall more as a kind of a more traditional painting, which I absolutely rarely make anymore, things that hang more normally on the wall. But I like that this sort of odd boulder-like shape was kind of operating almost like a shield or a plaque on the wall, maybe. And then I just thought I should show you some images of sketchbooks in terms of thinking processes and ways that color and form and content gets built into the work through the thinking process. Also, I should say I'm somebody who has never been able to make what should I say, like a behaving sized painting, right? I'm always working at way too big size or way too small size. It's either monumental or minimal or microscopic. And so the sketchbooks become a really nice way for me to think through things, and then I can manifest them either in the piece on the left here as a 3D printed form that's then spray painted, or as a monumental sort of inflatable sculpture. And I like that I get to think of these smaller objects as sort of almost like the offspring of the larger things. Or I made this piece called Scatterwall, which I was thinking of a scatological thinking, right? The idea of archaeological digs finding animal poop and kind of being able to age things or understand what the original animal was just from its residue. So these are built with, some of them are poured plaster, some of them are cut plywood, some of them are sewn fabric, and some of them are 3D printed. So just a couple of details. And again, spray painted on the top. Okay, so I just wanted to, this is the most recent very large installation that I did before COVID hit. And it actually closed down 2 months into the show, so we didn't get the full run of the show, but at least it got installed and documented, so all is good there. But I was really thinking about my sci-fi geekdom, right? And I talked about this idea of two states of being, right? And so I wanted to think about landscape again in this show, and also how I create an immersive experience for the viewer. So I invited a collaborator of mine, Joshua Patterson, to make this amazing audio environment for the work to also exist in. And I had a fabulous studio assistant, Ai-Chi Su, who I believe is here with us today. So thanks, Ai-Chi, for coming. Hey. And so what we built was this sort of we built an immersive environment in the gallery space, which is actually a music hall. It's a black box space. So I took advantage of that black box space and darkened everything else down so that you were only really feeling or seeing the work in the space. So it felt very like a nightscape. So here are a couple of images of it. I tried to pack the work in. I painted a boatload of rugs, a boatload of bean bags. I made a variety of types of inflatables, some that were more quilted and flat, some that were more volumetric. Some wore garments like wife beater t-shirts, like from that mesh fabric, right, from the 80s. This is my Bananarama 80s knowledge coming back in. And then I also included like old VHS tape that was dangling from the work, zip ties that were dangling from the work, rope that held the work up. So it's sort of this conglomerative list of materials that seems very chaotic, but they are all kind of readily available from hardware stores or thrift stores or stuff like that. But yes, most of them, a lot of them were either with the PVZ coated ripstop nylon, they could be lit internally. So the center one here is internally lit. And then we also used the theatrical lights in the black box space itself to kind of also create a overarching sense of black light glow, because I not only wanted to reference landscape, but I also wanted to reference laser tag places or glow in the dark golf places. Like I wanted to be both kitsch and futuristic at the same time, like super low and super high. It's not really ever super high, but if that makes sense. So I like that it's not necessarily one reference point that I'm looking for, but this sort of idea that people are coming in and recognizing parts, but also excited by the experience of looking at the whole and feeling like it's something new that they haven't seen before. I also, this is Josh on the lower left performing live during the opening performance. And so he had his laptop, he had an iPad, he has a synth keypad, and he was creating this beautiful abstract audio environment while the performers rolled around both inside the work and then were wearing these very dumb unitards to kind of code them as part of the sculptural qualities of the work. And they were young dancers from the local university, from the drama departments. They're very generous to come in and help me out. Can you see this now? Curtis, could you tell me, can you see what I see now? Okay.
Yep, it's going.
Okay, I just had to change it to desktop, so sorry. Okay, so hopefully while I was messing around visually, you could sort of hear the qualities of the work that were happening, but the sound was a really nice combination of metallic, crisp sounds and something that was more volumetric and rich and deep and blobby kind of. And so the performers were rolling around relative to that audio. And then Josh was also responding to the movement of the objects as well. I'm not going to play this one, but in this piece, I used Zoom as a platform. And Josh's, maybe I'll just play it quickly as I'm talking. Josh's audio, and he and I were on Zoom together, sort of performing with a miniature landscape on my dining room table, as opposed to the monumental landscape that I built in the show. So COVID kind of has forced everybody to utilize Zoom. And so and this is also at the invitation of my colleague, Mark Jeffrey, to do a performance on Zoom. So he's really been engaging with that platform in a really exciting as an artistic platform. And then also during COVID, I've been making more physical drawings. Maybe it's been nice to slow down in terms of the large scale work that I've been doing and be able to sort of refocus my attention on things that I can do on my dining room table. And so these are folded, crumpled paper that's then spray painted in the studio. And then I bring them into the dining room table and use Prismacolor pencil to add detail to the places where the stencil tape gets pulled off. So that's one form of slower or more maybe intimate making. And then more of the sketchbooks that I've been working on, building these sketchbooks as art objects in themselves, and really translating notes that I might have made in the sketchbook from earlier in their lifespans into sort of coded, hidden kind of secret text that's no longer legible necessarily, but there's some sense of some form of communication going on in the collection of imagery. And then I also did a Brooklyn Art Library, their sketchbook project. So I was excited about sort of thinking about this idea of a constraint, which is a single book, and how I can actually think about physicalizing or cutting into or destroying and adding to the surfaces of each page, and folding as well as drawing on top of. So it's a combination of Sharpie marker, highlighter, Post-it notes, pencil, charcoal, graphite, hole punch, all that, and Prismacolor pencil again. And drawings as well, where I am laying over, I'm sometimes thinking about brain space and mapping and kind of thoughts in your head. And I did it, all of these pieces I donated to various local auctions to support Black Lives Matter, to support LGBTQIA programs in the city, as a way to sort of add another layer of responsibility to the, my art making practice, and to respond to these were happening in the summertime, obviously in response to all the activist and anti-racist work that was happening across the world. So this is one of the ways that I, in addition to joining the protest, that I was sort of excited to be able to give back. I also made these extreme protection suits, which very silly, and this couple saw me on the news and came and got their Christmas card photographed in them. So, but it was the idea of sort of making these forms that would hold you at 6 feet apart, in a very funny way. One last thing I should mention is that I really do use humor as an important tool in my work, as a way to invite people in, or be able to allow people to hear what's being said or being given, but in such a way that it's not pointing a finger necessarily. And then the extreme protection suits painted on and shown at Hyde Park Art Center for the Artist Run Chicago show later in again with Mark Jeffrey. He is a major supporter. Thank you, Mark, of my work. So just to sort of see, I was just thinking with this grid pattern and paint job about the Zoom platform and all these squares that we're all seeing every day. So that was part of the reasoning of that pattern. Another piece that was built, like I was thinking of this as Attack of the Molecule, that was done for Art in Place. So this is my house on the right, and I sewed these panels and hung them in the windows so that it kind of brought the whole piece together as a sort of internally glowing lit organism. And then the last piece I really wanted to show you today that I've been working on is this piece, Clown, the Laughing Stock it's called, which was obviously a reference to the political leadership at the time that I built it, which was still at the end of middle of last year. And so I was really liking this idea. In this piece, I changed the design of how the fan enters the piece at the back to become a flexible entry point, so that any fan from any country could be inserted into the work and could fill it and give it life. And that the panel, the stripy panel at the front that was seen in the windows of the house in the last image, becomes the bag, the duffel bag that holds the piece inside it and can move it, can be taken on a plane and moved across the globe. So that sort of sense of portability and mobility has been something that I've been thinking about as long as I've been making the work, but I really like in this piece that I was able to redesign the nature of the work to build that thinking into it more deliberately. Okay, I'm just conscious of time. Maybe, I know I have a lot more, but I'm gonna exit here. Well, one last thing I did want to show you, sorry, is the last thing I want to show you is I'm collaborating with my colleague Judith Brotman, who's here today, and Cameron Claiborne, who is currently a grad in the sculpture department at Yale, with you guys on this project where we're not quite sure where it's going to end up yet, but we've been sharing materials with one another and sharing sort of ideas of how we could collaborate with one another. And so to be thinking about, like, I've added elements of Cameron's work on the left to smaller stuffed objects that I've been making. And I've pierced one of my objects with a knife from Judith and an embroidered embellished napkin that she makes. So this sort of idea of a very thinking about the vulnerable body in the way that we're thinking about collaborating. Okay, I want to leave time for questions, so why don't I stop the share there?
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you everyone for coming. This has
Thank
been
you guys
wonderful.
so much for coming, everybody, and really thanks for all the notes in the chat too. That's very sweet of you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Claire.
Thank you.